Well, have you ever heard of Tantalus? Dr. Parke is smarter than I am. You didn't need me to tell you that. But he knows these ancient Greek myths and legends, and he pointed out the relevance of Tantalus for our lesson tonight. And so I said, well, I better figure out who Tantalus is. He was also mentioned by Homer. You know, we read from Homer a week or two ago, and here we go in the Odyssey. As Odysseus is touring Hades, I believe, he says, I saw Tantalus in violent torment, standing in a pool, and the water came nigh unto his chin. He seemed as one athirst, but could not take a drink. For as often as that old man stooped down eager to drink, so often would the water be swallowed up and vanish away, and at his feet black earth would appear, for some god made all dry. Summary, Tantalus is standing neck deep in water, but every time he goes to take a drink, the water recedes to the point that it just gets down to the dirt and he can never take a drink. One other tantalizing aspect of his experience. And trees high and leafy let stream their fruits above his head, pears and pomegranates and apple trees with their bright fruit, and sweet figs and luxuriant olives. But as often as that old man would reach out toward these to clutch these amazing fruits with his hands, the wind would toss them to the shadowy clouds. So Tantalus is where we, of course, get the word tantalize, and he was a proverb. Tantalus punishments in ancient Greece was a reference to those who have good things but are not permitted to enjoy them. Now, we believe as Christians that every good and perfect gift is from above. It comes from the Father of lights, right? Many of you could tell me that's from James chapter 1, verse 17. We believe good gifts are from God. But in tonight's passage, Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, we find an evil that Koheleth has seen under the sun. Now, Koheleth, what we call the writer of Ecclesiastes, because that's what he calls himself, he begins chapter 6 with these words. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. What is that evil? Well, a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet, and here comes the evil that he's seen under the sun, these good gifts are from God. God gave this man these amazing things, and what happened? Yet God does not give him the power to enjoy them. The first 9 or so verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 6, this theme is prominent. God does not give him power to enjoy the gifts that God has given him. So why did God, or how did God not give him the power to enjoy those gifts? How did he prevent this man from enjoying what he's worked for? The first answer is right there at the end of verse 2. God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity, and it is a grievous evil. So the first way that God prevents this man from enjoying the gifts of God is he has to watch a stranger enjoy them instead. Who does the writer of Ecclesiastes have in mind? Well, we've mentioned several times that the writer of Ecclesiastes may very well be Solomon. He may have himself in mind. And if you read this passage and think of Solomon, I think you're on the right track. Here's one reason why. There are 4 Hebrew words in order in this passage that are also in order in a famous passage about Solomon. So in this passage, Ecclesiastes 6:2 has a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor. So those 4 words, gives, wealth, possessions, and honor. They also appear in 2 Chronicles 1:12. God tells Solomon, wisdom and knowledge are granted to you. But then he says, I will also give you riches, possessions, and honor. So those 4 words, there's a variation in riches and wealth, but the Hebrew word is the same. Those 4 words appear in the Chronicles retelling of the Solomon story, where God tells Solomon, ask for anything, I'll give it to you. Solomon asks for wisdom, and God says, I'll give you wisdom, but I'll also give you wealth, possessions, and honor. So whether or not you think Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, we would be justified in considering the life of Solomon important biblical context for this passage. So the grievous evil that he talks about first, God lets another man enjoy him. It really is broken into three parts. The first part is God gave him everything he desired. That literally happened to Solomon. We can read a little bit of the surrounding verses. 2 Chronicles 1, 7 through 12. In that night, God appeared to Solomon and said to him, ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said to God, in verse 10, now give me wisdom and knowledge. Verse 11, God answered Solomon, because this was in your heart, and you've not asked for possessions, wealth, and honor, or the life of those who hate you, and have not asked even for a long life, but have asked for wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may govern my people, over whom I have made you king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to you. I will also give you riches, possessions, and honor, such as none of the kings who were before you, and none after you shall have the like. So that's how it came about that Solomon eventually made silver more common than paving stones in Jerusalem. The writer of 1 Kings talked about Solomon's prosperity with even greater terms. Listen to the weight, the biblical weight that these phrases carry when the writer of 1 Kings describes the reign of Solomon. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. That traces all the way back to Genesis when God made the original promises to Abraham. They ate and drank and were happy. That's what 1 Kings 4:20 says. And I need to apologize because you may remember the first or second lesson, I said the only time that phrase, eat, drink, and be merry or be happy, is used positively in the Bible is in Ecclesiastes. But I missed this one. 1 Kings 4:20, describing the abundance of prosperity under Solomon's reign, they ate, drank, and were happy. Verse 21, Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And then skip to verse 25. Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. So the Bible writer is just gushing in praise over the way that Solomon's reign resulted in prosperity for all of Israel. It was just the fulfillment of so many promises from Genesis and from the early books of the Old Testament. Yet somehow, the same thing that happens in Ecclesiastes 6:2 also happened to Solomon. The man who had everything did not have the power to enjoy what he possessed. Did Solomon have the power to enjoy what he possessed? Well, on the one hand, we could look at his life and say, yeah, surely he enjoyed all that stuff. He kept working to acquire so many things. But that fact, the fact that he kept working to acquire so many things, I think betrays the fact that it was true of Solomon. He did not have the power to enjoy what he possessed. The man who spent 7 years building the temple for the Lord, the very next verse, that's 1 Kings 7:3 or 7:1, tells us he spent 13 years building his own house. But the most obvious clue that Solomon was not able to enjoy everything that he had acquired was that he kept acquiring wives. Not only did he keep acquiring wives, but he kept acquiring foreign wives. And so we get to 1 Kings chapter 11. And the writer of 1 Kings describes Solomon's downfall. We can see it there starting in verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. Solomon's dissatisfaction, his inability to enjoy what he acquired, led him to these foreign wives who led him to worshiping foreign gods, and it was the source of his downfall. And then a stranger enjoyed everything that he had worked for. Skip to verse 9. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, you've not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to you and your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I've chosen. So God tells Solomon, what you've worked for is going to go to a stranger. And then the next verses, the rest of chapter 11, tells the names of those strangers. The first one is Hadad the Edomite, verse 14. Where did this guy come from? Well, there was bad blood between Hadad's family and King David and his men. And so since the time Hadad was a little kid, he had been hiding out in Egypt. For decades he's been gone, but then God's going to bring him back to take vengeance for his family. And Solomon, more specifically Solomon's son who would come after him, would see so much of what Solomon had worked for enjoyed by a stranger. Same thing for Rezin, the son of Eliada, verse 23. It's another enemy of David. He's been hiding out in Damascus. And then the third enemy God raised up that would enjoy all that Solomon had worked for. You've heard of this one, I'm sure. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He's infamous in the Old Testament for being a bad guy. He's infamous for being a bad king. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, verse 26, an Ephraimite of Zereda, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, also lifted up his hand against the king. Can you imagine Solomon hearing that and saying, wait, did you say Jeroboam? The servant? He's going to enjoy the orchards that I've planted? He's going to enjoy the buildings that I've built? That guy? You can imagine, and it's just my imagination, but you can imagine Solomon writing Ecclesiastes with Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, in mind. Thinking, this is the guy that's going to inherit 11/12 or 10/12 of all that I've worked for? God tells him in verse 26 of 1 Kings chapter 11, yes, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So that's one of the ways that God might prevent a man from enjoying the gifts that God gives. He has to watch a stranger enjoy them instead. There's a second way. This one might feel more difficult for us to relate to, maybe not. I think it's such an uncommon experience in our life, in our circles, that maybe it can be hard to relate to. But it's this: if a man has no burial. Look at verse 3 of Ecclesiastes 6. If a man fathers 100 children, lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, I say, and also that he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity, goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. So the second way God prevents a man from enjoying his wealth is that he has no burial. Solomon says, stillborn child is better off than he. You know, I mentioned last week when we talked about two is better than one, I mentioned the first time I saw a man in real life that seemed to be completely alone. The end of that story is that when that man died, his estranged brother showed up and paid for a decent burial for this man. The man that I don't think wanted anything to do with his family a brother showed up just to make sure that there was a notice put in the paper and the man had a decent burial. It illustrates just something about human nature, that it just feels wrong if a person doesn't have a good burial. And so, to the writer of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth says, I would rather not be born than live a life and have a bunch of kids and then have no burial. I think because it would be a sign that you were alone at the end of your life and you were rejected by those that you love. So, third way that God prevents a man from enjoying his wealth comes at verse 4. He dies like everybody else. Verse 4 says, it comes in vanity, talking about the stillborn child, goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it, the stillborn child, finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to the one place? So I think now is as good a time as any to bring up a psalm that Dr. Parke has mentioned several times in our working together. Psalm 49 has a lot of overlapping themes with Ecclesiastes. I'll read for you verses 10 through 13 now. Well, through 14. For a man sees that even the wise die. The fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. Their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling places to all generations. Though they called lands by their own names, man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence, yet after them people approve of their boasts. Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd. The upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol with no place to dwell. So I'm sure it's easy for you to see the similarities between Ecclesiastes and Psalm 49. Both the psalmist and Koheleth, if you just take what I just read at face value, you might say, well, they seem to have no idea that anything happens to a person after he dies. Yet, if you know Ecclesiastes and if you know Psalm 49, you know that that's not the end of the story. Both writers do have a keen awareness that there is something after a man dies. In Ecclesiastes, it's judgment. God will judge every man's works, Ecclesiastes 12:1. In Psalm 49, verse 15, follows that passage with something that might make you say, well, wait a second, you do believe that there's something after death. Verse 15 says, but God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. So we should keep in mind as we read Koheleth's laments over the fact that when a person dies, they're dead, just like the animals. Both Koheleth and the writer of Psalm 49, and also you and I know that even if here under the sun, looking around with our eyes, it looks like death is the end, we know it's not the end. And in fact, the most important thing we can do now on earth is make sure that we're prepared for the judgment that will come when we die. We left off in verse 7. Verse 7 says, this is Ecclesiastes 6 again, all the toil of a man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. You know, the idea that we can't find ultimate satisfaction here on earth is, like Koheleth says, it is on the one hand a grievous evil. Yet on the other hand, I see it as a providential gift of God, that this earth leaves us longing. I think the person that, for me, best captured that idea was C.S. Lewis. We quoted from Lewis just a few weeks ago. Let me see if I have the quote here. If we find in ourselves a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, The most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. So this unsatisfied desire, this fact that you can have everything and yet still feel dissatisfied. The fact that you can eat a good meal and then 3 hours later you're hungry again. That very fact could be a gift of God that's pointing us to the fact that we were made for a different world. My favorite thing C.S. Lewis ever wrote is from a book called Till We Have Faces, a bit of an obscure Lewis book. But there are two characters having a dialogue in this book. One is Cupid and one is Psyche. And Cupid says this: I've always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. Sorry, Psyche said that. Cupid says, oh, Psyche, have I made you so little happy as that? No, you don't understand. Not that kind of longing. It was when I was happiest that I longed the most. It was on happy days when we were up there on the hills, the three of us with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Glome or the palace. Do you remember the color and the smell and looking at the gray mountain in the distance? And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't, not yet come. And I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And then this line: the sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, the longing to find the place where all the beauty came from. My country, the place where I ought to have been born. Do you think it all meant nothing? All the longing for home? For now, indeed, it feels not like going, but like going back. Lewis's autobiography is called Surprised by Joy. And the story of Lewis's life is that he found in himself an unsatisfied longing. And he realized that longing is pointing me to the Lord. And he found Christ because he couldn't find satisfaction here on earth.
Thank you, Tim. Our focus today, as Tim has illustrated, is the 6th chapter of Ecclesiastes. I have good news for you. Many interpreters of the Bible consider this to be the most depressing chapter in the Bible. The reason for that is because Ecclesiastes has 12 chapters and is designed to be read and understood as an entire unit. So the answer to all of these interrogatives that this preacher is asking is in the last chapter. We're stretching this out for 10 weeks to keep you, at bay thinking about these answers. And the answer is finally going to be God, right? He's the answer to every question, God. In church, it's either the Bible, Jesus, or God. That's the answer to every question. So it's true in Ecclesiastes, but not today, because he's not going to mention God today. But we know as Christian people. So we read Ecclesiastes and we say, why doesn't he just see what we see? Why doesn't he just feel what we feel? Why doesn't he just realize what we realize? And the answer is, well, he's going to in the 12th chapter, but just not today. So there's a warning here for us that we don't end up where the 6th chapter ends. Because the end of it all is we don't understand, and we don't have joy, we don't have peace, we don't have satisfaction. And therefore life is miserable. Well, yes and no, because we know the rest of the story. So I've simply summarized this chapter by making 4 statements, and we'll consider the 4 questions that he asked and answer them with these 4 statements. And then he concludes with one more question that he doesn't answer in this chapter. So the first point, as Tim has already said, is contained in the opening 2 verses, and that is that everything is not enough. You have everything, but it's not enough. Again, there's an evil that I've seen under the sun. It lies heavy on mankind, a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing. Yet, God doesn't give him the power to enjoy them. Turns out that everything is not enough. You're aware that every wealthy, extremely wealthy person that you could name, and there's an enormous fascination today about the wealth of Jeff Bezos, the guy who started Amazon, or Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett, and Elon Musk, and all of these billionaires. And Musk is rumored to one day be the first trillionaire. You think he needs a charitable donation idea? I got a chiller in mind. Anyway, there's a fascination with the fact that more and more and more and more and more people are millionaires. The rise of the stock market has made people 401k millionaires, and there are more and more millionaires than there have ever been before on the basis of their accumulated stock portfolios. So the media loves to talk about these things. They're fascinated with the wealth, and yet none of us would say that our country is less miserable than it's ever been. I think many of us might say our country's more miserable than it's ever been. And I would suggest that even Christians fight against, as it were, the pressure to believe that, well, if I just had more money, more possessions, more experiences, if I could just keep up with those guys, if I could just go on one of their vacations, et cetera, then we would be right where Koheleth says we'd be, which is that everything is not enough. I remember an experience. I'll tell this as a story on me. Years and years ago, Susan and I have some friends from Alabama, and we went to tour the Northwest, and we went through Glacier National Park. I had been to Montana before and had been told by people on the mission trip we were on at that time that the most beautiful road in America is the Going to the Sun Highway that crosses Glacier National Park. And we happened to be up there on a mission trip, and the road was closed by snow. It was July the 5th. The road was closed by snow, so you couldn't go on this road. But we went with some friends later, and it was indeed beautiful. But I found myself on this beautiful highway, and you turn a curve, you go around a curve, and you see this great valley and these huge mountain vistas, and you think, this is it. This is what they're talking about. And then for a minute you think, well, no, there's probably another one. And you take another curve, and then there's another great mountain vista and a great valley and lakes and sky and mountain. It's just gorgeous. And this is it. This is why we paid our money. By the way, it's a free road, but this is why we came to go on this, to get this view right here. But then you kept thinking, well, there's probably another one, or maybe there's another one, or surely there's another one. You train another curve, and there's another great vista. And I found in myself realizing that even the most beautiful, allegedly beautiful road in North America is not beautiful enough. It's not beautiful enough for me to say, I can die at peace. I've seen it all, seen the best, had the best, I know the best. I've enjoyed the best. I'm looking for another road to compare it to, and so forth. Everything's not enough. That's the problem with humanity. Everything's not enough. I would warn you that, as we're going to see in Ecclesiastes before we're done, that God is the tipping point. With God, God is enough. Without God, there's never enough. The human heart always seeks to manufacture more experience. The second question or statement that he makes is that we would be better off not being born. We would be better off not being born. Verse 3, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so the days of his years are many, his soul is not satisfied with life's. He also has no burial. I say a stillborn child is better off than he. We'd be better off not being born. His point, of course, is that you can live all your life, and really all you're doing, living a long life and having 100 children, is you're just multiplying your painful experiences. You're multiplying your disappointments. You'd be better off not being born. You say, Brother Greg, you don't believe that. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying Koheleth is saying that. He's saying that because he's not yet come to the end of the matter, which is, with God, that's not true. But at this point, he is saying it's true. It's true, better to not even be born, better to be stillborn and never see life than it is to walk through life, because life is a series of painful experiences. There's a third thing he states, and that is that nothing fills me up or satisfies me. Nothing. Verse 7, all of the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. The word appetite here doesn't merely mean food. It means all the other appetites we have. We could list a laundry list of things that capture our affections that we're interested in. What advantage has the wise man over the fool, he says, and what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. The sight of the eyes is a phrase that he uses in chapter 11. If you'll turn there a minute with me, chapter 11, verse 9. He concludes the next to the last chapter here in verse 9. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. Same phrase, the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. In other words, enjoy your appetites. But know this, you'll give an account to God for every one of them. You'll give an account to God for how you live your life, how you process your desires, whether or not you live under the authority of God, under the Son. Verse 9, back in chapter 6, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity or emptiness, striving after wind. In other words, we're never content. Nothing fills me up. Nothing satisfies me. I'm reminded of Paul's words in the last chapter of 1 Timothy 6, chapter 6, verse 3. We read, if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words of our Lord Christ and teaching that accords with godliness, he's puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. Again, his life is empty. We might supply Koheleth's word there as vanity. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy, for quarrels about words, which produce, and there's a list of bad things, produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, constant friction among people who are depraved in mind, depraved of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. Now there is great gain in godliness with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves through with many a pang. In other words, Paul is saying Koheleth is right in chapter 6. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. Nothing fills me up. Nothing. Got to go do something else. Got to have another experience. You know, I know what the phrase bucket list means. I'm not a big fan of the term, but that's my problem perhaps. I think you probably know what that means. Basically, it's the list of things you want to do before you kick the bucket. Your bucket list. Well, I've never known anybody that completed their list, but what if you ever did? Now, let's say you complete your list 1 year before you die, hypothetically. What are you going to do for a year? I don't know. I mean, just exist. I mean, I'm going to go down to Waffle House and eat, drink, and be merry. I don't know what you're going to do for a year. If you finish your bucket list before you die, then what are you going to do? The point is that there's a lot to do that has eternal value. There's also a lot to do that doesn't have eternal value. If you never, climb Pikes Peak, most people don't climb it, they drive it. You don't climb Mount Everest. You don't do something, that tests your limits and so forth. You don't have these ultimate life experiences. Does that mean you've failed as a human being? Does that mean that you've somehow failed to be all that you were intended to be? No, it sure doesn't. There's a lot of pretty places. There's a lot of fun to be had. There's a lot of good food to eat. There's a lot of wonderful places to see. There's a lot of wonderful people to hang out with. There's a lot of wonderful experiences yet to have, perhaps. And yet, does that mean that everything before this is inconsequential? None of us would say that. Nothing ever fills me up. My famous illustration of this, I've said this before, maybe you heard me say it, but I'll never forget an interview with Nick Saban. You know him. He was the head coach at LSU, won half a national championship. That was for all the LSU people out there. They split that national championship, but I digress. But he won the Associated Press national championship in 2003. They interviewed Saban after he had won the championship for the first time in Alabama about that experience at LSU. And he said his experience was that while they had just done the trophy presentation, and all the players, of course, for LSU were going around congratulating one another and enjoying the moment and so forth, he said his compelling thought was, how am I going to do this again next year? How do I repeat? He had been the national champion for less than 10 minutes. And he had already become miserable with the challenge to repeat. That's kind of what happens when we build our ultimate experiences in this world, under the sun. The problem under the sun is nothing ultimately satisfies. Koheleth diagnoses that. There is a fourth thing, quickly, and that is that essentially life is the same old, same old. That's what happens here. Verse 10, whatever has come to be has already been named, and it's known what man is, and that he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? Who knows what is good for man? while he lives a few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Life's the same old, same old. Whatever has come to be has already been named. You know, every experience has already been had. Every conversation has already been had. Every discovery has already been discovered. That's called this attitude. Everything that can be known is known. The more words, the more vanity. We have people talk. Have you ever just sat and listened to news shows ad infinitum? I mean, if your permanent television station is Fox News, I do not know how you are yet sane. They say the exact same thing. You know, CNN created Headline News years ago. Headline News was a 30-minute program, and then every 30 minutes they would repeat the news. And the deal was, you know, you can't just sit there and watch it all the time, so it doesn't matter when you turn in, we're going to give you the news. And so they would repeat the news every 30 minutes. Headline News, that was what that particular channel did, and made CNN a lot of money back in the day. Ted Turner got rich on Headline News. But eventually, the other news channels started doing the exact same thing, only different. And you have to manufacture programming because the news just doesn't change. Or you broaden news, or you embellish the news. You know, you go legendary. You know, this was a problem. Now it's an enormous problem. Grand problem. It's a tragic problem. Yeah, we don't have regular problems anymore. We have terrible problems. It is very, very depressing. The more words, the more vanity. The more you talk, the more you listen, the more you pay attention, it just becomes empty. Can we just stop talking and, you know, like chill out for a minute? There is something to be said for Jesus getting away by himself and not listening to the noise of his culture. Life is the same old, same old. You know, I think about this often. Jesus died at Passover. He celebrated Passover with his disciples. Jesus had celebrated Passover with his disciples before. And they thought that this Passover was just like last year's Passover, which was just like the Passover before that, which is just like the Passover before that. Only Jesus knew that this Passover was going to be different because this would be his last Passover. They didn't know this was the ultimate Passover. And the pointer value of the Old Testament celebration of Passover was finally going to be consummated that very night when Jesus is betrayed. The next morning he would be crucified, and the ultimate Passover lamb would die. But they didn't know that. They didn't understand when Jesus went to wash their feet to leave them an example. They didn't understand that Jesus was going to be betrayed by one of their own. They didn't understand that Jesus was going to be brutalized by the whips of the chief priests and by the Romans. They didn't understand that Jesus was going to be crucified. They didn't understand that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead. They didn't understand that Jesus was going to be ascending to the Father and the Holy Spirit was going to come and fill their lives, and they were going to be thrust into a life of service, which included great suffering. They didn't understand any of that. This was just the same old, same old, same old. We got to be careful, don't we, that we don't see life that way. So Koheleth ends this chapter, and he asks a question: for who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Is there more? Is there better? That's a fair question. I would tell you that's a philosophical question. If you find somebody that wants to be philosophical about their life, lean in and say, sure, I'm happy to talk to you about that. You want me to tell you what's better than this world? You want me to tell you what's better than life under the sun? Let me tell you about life beyond the sun. Let me tell you about life after death. Let me tell you about the one who came to give himself for you. Let me tell you about the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. Koheleth doesn't speak those words, but we have the vantage point of time and revelation, and we, being New Testament, New Covenant people, we know the answer to that. Is there more? Is there better? Yes, there is. His name is Jesus. Let's not forget that. So there you have the most depressing chapter in the entire Bible. All right, Brother Tim, is there a question? Even one?
Three.
Three questions. Oh, we've struck gold.
All right. Question number 1. When it is said that God appeared to Solomon, does that mean he saw God? Not even Moses saw God. Somebody's listening to your sermon this morning.
No. You want me to say more than that? No. God did not appear to Solomon in the way that we... Let me say it a different way. Okay, there is a tension in the Bible that we must contend with language in the Old Testament. The Bible tells us plainly that no man can see God and live. And so God does not appear to people because God wants them to live. So in the sense that we want to assign God physical characteristics, we want to make God so tall, so wide, so strong. We want to describe God in terms of clothing or fiery eyes or red complexion, or these are all human terms. And yet God is spirit. So God is not ever going to demonstrate himself in human appearance. Ever. Instead, God sends his Son, who is the exact representation of the image of God. No man has seen God at any time. So when God appears, and to use that language, God appears as a vision. God appears as a dream. God appears as a spirit who speaks. God appears as a voice at Jesus' baptism. We're talking about the Father now, right? So it is a mistake to say, when the Bible uses that language, that God appears in human form. God never appears in human form. The Son appears in human form, but never the Father. So let's understand the way the language is used. God appears in a vision. God appears in a dream. God appears in a spirit. God appears in a voice, but God does not appear 7 feet tall or 20 years old or 40 years old or a long flowing beard. God does not appear like that. That's my answer.
It gets a little confusing.
It does. It does.
Do we have any idea who the stranger was? I'll preface this question by saying it came in early, and I think maybe even before we began to address that question. The stranger who enjoyed Solomon's wealth, we named 3 from 1 Kings 11. Hadad. Who's the second one? Can't pull it out. Somebody's saying it. And then, of course, Jeroboam.
Jerry.
The son of Nebat. But maybe there's more answer to that question than just those 3. Any thoughts on that?
I agree. There's probably more answers because he had a lot of stuff, and he probably shared it with a lot of people, if you know what I mean. They took it from him. Solomon had palaces and fortresses and stables and gardens all over Israel. So I'm sure several people got on the graft, in the graft line for Solomon's riches.
After all the things that Solomon worshipped, foreign deities, what ultimately happened to him the remainder of his days? Are there scriptures that discuss this or outside Bible sources other than the Bible? Related question, I'll read them both together. Do you think Solomon thought building God a house covered what he owned and that freed him to do whatever he wanted? You think he felt like, okay, I did that one big thing, I built God a temple, so now I kind of got to pass on everything else?
Well, I hesitate to get in the mind of anybody. I'm having a hard time getting in your mind. So probably ought to stay out of Solomon's mind, even if I could get in his mind. So I don't know what he thought, what he didn't think, what he could have, might have, ought to thought. It's always struck me, Tim read the passage, but it's always struck me, it took him 7 years to build the temple and 14 years to build his own house. I don't know, it feels a little out of balance to me, but maybe I'm reading too much into that. Maybe after 7 years, the bricklayers went on strike. I don't know. Decided they weren't going to work for him anymore. He didn't pay on time or something. I'm not sure. I do think that the first question was, what was Solomon doing after he built the temple? Was that something like that?
What ultimately happened to him the remainder of his days?
Well, he married more women. He acquired more horses. He built more vineyards. He planted more trees and gardens, and he just kept doing stuff. What you'll remember is that, do you remember the circumstance, I don't know how much time we have, do you remember the circumstance that actually led to the division of the kingdom? So eventually the tribes of Judah and Benjamin were given to the son of Solomon, Rehoboam. And the other 10 were given to Jeroboam, the northern kingdom, which came to be called Israel, Judah to the south. You remember that Rehoboam, Solomon's true son, sought the elders, the wise men, as it were, of his father's kingdom. Let's call them his cabinet, his senior advisors. And he sought their advice as to how he should continue or not continue the taxation program that Solomon had on the people. The council of Solomon's advisors, this is after Solomon died, his cabinet, we'd call it, counseled the true heir, Rehoboam, you need to back off because the people have had this enormous burden of taxation from your father. The reason Solomon built and built and built and built and built, because he did all of that on the backs of the people. He took their money. He taxed them. And so he's this enormously rich man, in part, not completely, of course, but in part because he had this heavy taxation burden. And you remember that Rehoboam decided, no, he had young friends. The scripture says he counseled with his own young friends, peers. So think a 40-year-old and his friends versus an 80-year-old and his friends. So Rehoboam has these young friends, and they tell him, no, turn it up, man. We need to get more. And so he upped the taxation rates instead of decreased them. And that's what blew up the nation. That was the circumstance that led to the division of the kingdom, the alteration of Solomon's taxation schedule. So I'm reminded, what did Solomon do? Well, he collected money, a lot of it, and he spent a lot of money. And if you tour Israel today, you can see they'll take you all over the country and show you this was Solomon's this and Solomon's that and Solomon's this and Solomon's that. And they'll show you all these things. because he had a lot of money. What did he do with his time? He just built more stuff and married more women. Which, by the way, if you marry more women, you have to have houses. And if you have, children with those women, you got to have houses. You got to have something. So he just kept going.
I'll read one set of verses that are relevant to that question, because part of the question was, are there other books outside of the Bible that tell about this? And my first reaction is, well, maybe, probably, but I'm not really interested in those. I'm interested in the Bible. But the Bible does actually mention one of those books in 1 Kings 11:41. The rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. So there was a book. We don't have it, and I would be extremely suspicious of anybody that trotted one out and said, here's the book that was mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 11. I'd be very suspicious. I'm trusting what this book says.
Okay. We're done. So let's pray together and we'll be dismissed. God, thank you that you love us so. Thank you for the opportunity to continue to study your word. Thank you for Ecclesiastes. It sharpens us, Lord. It challenges us, confronts us, and then ultimately comforts us. We're thankful. Thank you for Tim, for Ivan, and for our continued study together. Give grace to our people, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.